Good morning and welcome to Washington, D.C., the United States House of Representatives and the Committee on Education and the Workforce Subcommittee on Early Childhood, Elementary, and Secondary Education. The committee will come to order. A quorum is present. Without objection, the chair is authorized to call a recess at any time. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony to examine the covert influence of foreign governments and organizations, including the Chinese Communist Party, on the United States K through 12 schools. I am Aaron Bean. I'm going to be your host and chair of the committee as we embark on a journey of fact-finding and to figure out just what the heck is going on. Our hearing today is entitled "The Academic Freedom Under Attack: Loosening the CCP Grip on America's Classroom." The CCP influence is rampant in America's classrooms. We will talk about that today. Over 500 K through 12 schools across the United States have allowed the CCP to establish itself in their halls under the guise of Confucius classrooms. But when you pull back the curtain on these cultural exchange centers, you find a CCP-backed agenda that undermines the principles upon which our education system is built. The risk posed by the proliferation of communist Confucius classrooms is threefold, threatening America's national, geopolitical, and academic interests. One of the most alarming threats is to our national security. A recent report revealed that numerous Confucius classrooms are strategically located around U.S. military bases. Moreover, it uncovered that elite American secondary schools like Thomas Jefferson High School for Science and Technology are partnered with Chinese military schools supervised by the Chinese defense industry like Tsinghua University to develop academic programming. These ties raise serious concerns about the safety and security of military children and secrets. The CPC's presence near our bases can be seen as a direct attempt to target and influence these vulnerable populations, potentially compromising our national security in the process. Furthermore, Confucius classrooms pose a significant geopolitical risk. They are explicitly organized by the CCP Politburo to project soft power on American students. This strategy is straight out of the Soviet playbook. In 1960, the USSR established the People's Friendship University as a culturary and literary exchange program to indoctrinate students in developing countries like Africa, Asia, and Latin America, with notable alumni including Marxist revolutionaries and world leaders. This blatant attempt to inject foreign ideologies into our schools undermines the fundamental purpose of American education. It goes without saying, we should be teaching American values in American schools. Which leads to my third point. Confucius classrooms risk our academic security. Every dollar that flows into American classrooms from the CCP comes with strings attached. And the most important string is the requirement that instructors censor themselves to appease Beijing. It would be remarkable to even hear 4 words in a Confucius classroom: Tibet, Taiwan, Tiananmen Square. This censorship stifles academic freedom, which is the cornerstone of our educational system. Academic freedom encourages open dialogue, the free exchange of ideas, and the pursuit of knowledge without fear of reprisal. Confucius classrooms, however, undermines these principles by fostering an environment where educators are pressured to align themselves with the CCP agenda, stifling critical thinking and true intellectual exploration. We must recognize the consequences of this infiltration that will harm generations to come. Our children deserve an education that empowers them to think critically, develop their own perspectives, and become informed and engaged citizens. Allowing CCP propaganda to infiltrate our schools robs children of this opportunity. The danger of Confucius classrooms in American K through 12 schools cannot be overstated. They threaten our national security, compromise our geopolitical interests, and erode our academic freedom. Today, the committee has taken a stand against CCP influence, and we will continue to work tirelessly to safeguard our educational institutions from foreign influence. It's our duty to protect our kids and our children's future by preserving the integrity of American education. On a final note, the committee supports teaching Chinese language, history, and culture. China has a rich culture that our students should learn about. We support the Chinese people who have been horribly oppressed by their government. What we do not support is the CCP indoctrination and the rewriting of history. With that, I yield for the ranking member for an opening statement. Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Chairman Bean, and thank you in advance to our witnesses for your testimony today. Once again, the committee Republicans are holding a hearing on a topic that will only further their extreme agenda, inject divisive partisan politics into our children's classrooms. We are actually nearly 11 days from a potential government shutdown, and here we are unconcerned about the impact of a shutdown on our economy, and we're also facing a child care cliff at the end of this month. House Republicans proposed solution is an array of devastating cuts to the federal funding that fuels our children's education. According to my colleagues on the Appropriations Committee, proposed cuts to labor HHS appropriations would eliminate access to early childhood education for over 50,000 children through cuts in Head Start, potentially remove over 200,000 teachers from classrooms serving low-income students through cuts in Title I, and wipe out federal support for vital academic programs that support over 5 million English learners. Rather than finding ways to help families keep a roof over their heads, put food on the table, find affordable, quality child care, the majority would rather take the committee's time promoting conspiracy theories and dubious research. By contrast, just last week, the Congressional Democrats introduced the Child Care Stabilization Act to address a potential child care crisis and preserve vital child care stabilization funding expiring at the end of this month. The bill would keep thousands of child care providers afloat, save child care slots for millions of children, and help ensure access to quality, affordable child care for working families. It's my hope that colleagues across the aisle will help us save the child care sector from potential collapse. Furthermore, I'm concerned that the majority thought it appropriate to hold a congressional hearing on an unsubstantiated report which is paid for by a group that the Southern Poverty Law Center has designated as an extremist organization. Now, Dr. Fox and I have always prided ourselves in the fact that we can disagree without being disagreeable, but this report and the allegations in it have already been debunked by a 2019 Senate investigation, hearing, and report, and this hearing gives it credibility it does not deserve. And I ask unanimous consent to insert that report into the record.
Without objection.
We can provide students with an inclusive, accurate, and well-funded education without conspiracy theories that fuel anti-Asian discrimination. Rather, we should encourage students to discover other languages and cultures and encourage schools to create safe and inviting educational environments. It would be better use of our time today if members focused on funding the government, improving school infrastructure, closing academic achievement gaps, and confronting other serious challenges facing children, educators, and families. So I hope we can have a productive and respectful discussion today. I thank the witnesses for their time. Yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Scott, and good morning to you, and good morning to our witnesses. Pursuant to Committee Rule 8C, all committee members who wish to insert written statements into the record may do so by submitting them to the committee clerk electronically in Microsoft Word format by 5 p.m. after 14 days from the start of this hearing, which is October 3rd, 2023, and without objection, the hearing record will remain open for 14 days after the date of this hearing to allow such statements and other material referenced during the hearing to be submitted for the hearing record. And with that, members, let's get to our all-star panel. For the first introduction, I will yield time to the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Wahlberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you as well for letting me weigh on this important subcommittee and to give me the opportunity to introduce Mr. Mike Gonzalez, the Angeles T. Arredondo E. Pluribus Unum Senior Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. He writes on multiculturalism, assimilation, nationalism, and foreign policy. He spent nearly 20 years as a journalist, 15 of them reporting from Europe, Asia, and Latin America. He left journalism to join the administration of President George W. Bush, where he was speechwriter for Securities and Exchange Commission Chairman Chris Cox. before moving on to the State Department's European Bureau. Mr. Gonzalez holds a bachelor's degree in communications from Boston's Emerson College and a master's in business administration from Columbia Business School. We welcome you.
Mr. Gonzalez, welcome. And to all of our panelists, we're about to turn the clock on you, and you got 5 minutes. How about that? So we all get 5 minutes, as I mentioned to you earlier. So enjoy, welcome. We're glad to have you here, and you are recognized for 5 minutes, Mr. Gonzalez.
For inviting me. My name is Mike Gonzalez. I am the Angeles T. Arredondo Senior Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. The views I express are my own, should not be construed as representing any official position of the Heritage Foundation. As you said, I lived in Asia as a journalist for a decade, spending my last 2 years in Hong Kong as editor of the Wall Street Journal's Asian editorial page, from where I directed coverage of Asian issues, including the People's Republic of China and the Chinese Communist Party. I'm also proudly on the advisory board of Parents Defending Education, whose July study, Little Red Classrooms, has led to this hearing. The classrooms in question refer to the Confucius classrooms, which are the K-12 school equivalents of Confucius Institutes. The institutes are PRC-sponsored centers set up at universities around the world. They teach Mandarin and Chinese culture, but also fund China research. In the words of a comprehensive heritage study released in March, the institutes and the classrooms give CCP agents a foothold in the U.S. In exchange for money, the schools self-censor about the reality of the PRC and the CCP and allow the spread of PRC propaganda. In 2015, I authored one of the earliest papers on the institutes. One of my recommendations was for the Congress to explore, quote, whether the PRC's efforts to influence Americans through academia and Hollywood represent an attempt by a foreign government to manipulate a democratic population, unquote. 8 years later, this question remains at the heart of the issues facing this committee. Last week, I spoke to Ian Oxnevad, a researcher at the National Association of Scholars, who is currently writing a study on all these issues, and he told me there are a lot more Confucius classrooms than institutes. Once again, the classrooms are K-12, the institutes are in colleges and universities. A 2019 Senate report said there were 519 Confucius classrooms operating in the U.S. Oxnevad estimates that there are still around 500 classrooms in our country. Just because they're not called Confucius classrooms does not mean they're not, he told me. They are basically a turnkey program for Mandarin that is all expenses paid. Paid by whom, you may ask? By the CCP. Most of the institutes and classrooms were supposed to have been closed. In March 2021, the U.S. Senate voted to prohibit funding for universities that hosted the institutes unless the contracts had clear provisions that protected academic freedom. The absence of transparency has been a big part of this problem. Of 111 institutes that have closed or are in the process of closing, at least 28 have been replaced with similar programs, and at least 58 have maintained close relationships with their former Confucius Institute partner. This duplicity reinforces my view that our government must ban all the institutes and classrooms. We must end all collaborations between U.S. institutions and Chinese entities affiliated with China's Ministry of State Security or other security and intelligence agencies. A foreign communist party cannot dictate what our children learn. The United States is an open society that enjoys the free exchange of ideas, whose people form opinions and then vote accordingly. China is none of those things. It is a communist dictatorship where the CCP retains a monopoly on power. Our two nations face, therefore, asymmetric informational warfare. China's influence on our schools is aimed at presenting to students a version of the PRC that does not accord with reality. China seeks to be seen as a normal country, say democratic Chile or Portugal. But China is an important country with many contributions to civilization, but China is not a normal country. All of China's 1.4 billion people have their liberties extremely restricted. China's most famous political prisoner is a publisher by the name of Jimmy Lai, who today, at the age of 75, languishes in solitary confinement in a Hong Kong prison on a trumped-up violation of China's draconian national security law. On the 26th of this month, Mr. Lai will mark 1,000 days in prison. Now, I know Jimmy Lai. Jimmy Lai is a friend of mine. I can tell the members of the Congress and the American people that Mr. Lai is a tireless fighter for liberty, one we must never forget. Xi Jinping put him in prison for speaking truth to power. The Confucius Institutes and the classrooms concealed this sordid record by restricting debate on Taiwan, Tibet, Tiananmen Square, the suffering of Jimmy Lai, and many, many other things. You, our political leaders, have the responsibility of stopping this gross interference on how the youngest among us learn about what is likely to be our main adversary for the 21st century. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Mr. Gonzalez, thank you so much for your testimony and coming before us. Let's introduce the rest of our panel, and then we will hear from each and every one of you. Our second witness is Ms. Gisela Perez Kusakawa, who is the executive. Was that good thing? Okay, good, very good. Ms. Kusakawa is the executive director of the Asian American Scholar Forum, which is in New York. She serves as on multiple nonprofit boards, including the Asian Pacific American Bar Association Education Fund, the Conference on Asian Pacific American Leadership, the National Filipino American Lawyers Association, and the Filipino American Lawyers Association of Washington, D.C. She has experience in multiple countries as a former Rotary Scholar and then teacher in Japan, studying Mandarin in Beijing, conducting research on IT development in the Czech Republic, and promoting business and job development in the rural villages of the Philippines. So please welcome, and we're going to come right back to you as we introduce the rest of the panel, but we welcome you and we're glad to have you here. Our next panelist will be introduced by our own Representative Mary Miller.
Our third witness is Mrs. Nicole Neily, who is president and founder of Parents Defending Education, a nonpartisan, nonprofit national organization giving parents the resources and support they need to advocate for their children's education. Thank you so much. Prior to launching Parents Defending Education, Mrs. Neily created Speech First, a nationwide membership organization that defends college students' free speech rights through litigation and other means. Mrs. Neily has also worked as president of the Franklin Center for Government and Public Integrity, a state-level investigative journalism organization, as executive director and senior fellow at the Independent Women's Forum and at the Cato Institute, where she created their Department of External Relations. Mrs. Neily holds a bachelor's degree in political science from the University of Illinois and a Master of Public Policy from Pepperdine University School of Public Policy. Welcome. Thank you.
And welcome. And our final witness will be introduced by Michelle Steele. Representative Steele, you're recognized.
And our last witness is Mr. Ryan Walters, who is State Superintendent of Public Instruction for the Oklahoma State Department of Education and is located in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. Previously, Mr. Walters taught 8 years as a history teacher at his hometown, McAllister High School. During his time at MHS, Walters taught advanced placement courses in world history, U.S. history, and U.S. government. The Oklahoma State Department of Education named Mr. Walters as an Oklahoma Teacher of the Year finalist in 2016. Additionally, Mr. Walters also serves as Executive Director of Every Kid Counts Oklahoma. Mr. Walters earned a bachelor's degree from Harding University. Welcome.
Welcome, Mr. Walters. And now up is Ms. Kusakawa. Welcome. We're glad to have you here, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chair Bean, Ranking Member Bobby Scott, and Ranking Member Bonamici, and members of the subcommittee, especially for the kind introductions and for allowing me to provide testimony today. As we take on U.S.-China tensions, it's important to recognize that the Asian American community has a long history of being treated as perpetual foreigners. Seen as perpetual foreigners, we too often are perceived as outsiders and make for convenient scapegoats as economic or national security threats. Therefore, it becomes essential that we do not allow U.S. tensions with a foreign Asian country to translate into an overreaction by the federal government or within our education system that leads to negative impacts for the Asian American community. We have seen the tragedy that can happen when we do not exercise caution and consider the Asian American experience. More than 80 years ago, over 120,000 U.S. residents of Japanese ancestry were incarcerated in remote detention camps in the name of national security, under the rationale that any people of Japanese descent are somehow more prone to committing acts of sabotage or espionage. Congress eventually acknowledged that these actions were motivated largely by racial prejudice, wartime hysteria, and a failing of political leadership. Yet decades after the systemic incarceration of Japanese Americans, we find ourselves repeating history. It has become a harmful pattern that when the United States has tensions with an Asian country, Asian Americans and immigrants face the backlash at home and become collateral damage. Perceived as not American, we too often are blamed for the actions of a foreign government or entity, face heightened scrutiny, and are subjected to questioning about our loyalty. The consequences of being perceived as perpetually foreign can often lead to fatal consequences. This was the case for Vincent Chin, a Chinese American who was murdered in 1982 by two white men who mistook him as Japanese at a time when US-Japan tensions were high due to economic competition. Like all too many before him, Vincent was treated as a scapegoat and blamed for the problems that the American auto industry faced in competition with Japan. In this modern age, Asian Americans are still made for convenient scapegoats, experiencing both years of anti-Asian hate and violence within their own neighborhoods and homes, and also heightened scrutiny from their places of learning or employment or by their own government. We have seen in the past decade how US government officials have fueled anti-Asian bigotry through xenophobic and anti-China rhetoric and policymaking. As a result, alarmingly, 1 in 5 Americans believe Asian Americans are partly responsible for COVID-19, and 1 in 3 Americans believe that Asian Americans are more loyal to countries other than the United States. Asian Americans such as Professor Xiaoxing Shi, Sherry Chen, Gong Chen, and Ming Hu have found themselves subjected to heightened scrutiny and their lives upended along with many other scholars. This intensified under the Department of Justice's China Initiative, and the decision by the administration to end the initiative was a welcome step towards healing for our communities, but we still have a long way to go in addressing how racial bias can permeate our society, federal government, and our academic institutions. An annual survey revealed that 1 in 2 Asian Americans do not feel safe due to their race and ethnicity, and 80% do not feel that they belong with young and female Asian Americans feeling the least like they belong. Of those surveyed, 47% attribute the violence that Asian Americans face based on the blame that they receive for Chinese government spying. Moreover, we have seen that Stop AAPI Hate has received 341 reports of anti-Asian discrimination involving the youth, with over half of the incidents involving anti-Chinese language. We need to do better for the Asian American community and our youth. While China's government does pose genuine threats, I ask that we look towards real solutions and nuanced responses to prevent broad, sweeping impacts that make Asian Americans and our youth collateral damage. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kusakawa. Thank you very much. Next is Ms. Neily. Ms. Neily, welcome to the committee, and you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Bean, Ranking Member Bonamici, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me. My name is Nicole Neily, and I am the president of Parents Defending Education. We began researching foreign funding in K-12 schools in March when a parent of Virginia's Thomas Jefferson High School for Science and Technology provided records showing that the school received over $1 million from Chinese government-linked entities. A few weeks ago, Fairfax County Schools revealed that these donations actually totaled $3.6 million. A former PTA board member told us that in exchange for these gifts, the donors were allowed to, quote, look under the hood at how the school was run, including floor plans, lesson plans, and student research projects. So we wondered, was this happening elsewhere? And if so, where? Unfortunately, trying to nail down the scope of this problem is difficult by design. These programs have existed in American schools for years, but much of it went underground following Secretary DeVos and Secretary Pompeo's efforts to rein in Confucius Institutes. We combed through publicly available data and filed dozens of FOIAs across the country to access contracts on these programs and traced money flowing through intermediary organizations such as the AASF Society and the College Board to districts. We found that over the past decade, over $17 million has flowed to 143 districts and private K-12 schools across 34 states and DC. This is likely a low figure, given that both the U.S. State Department and the Senate have estimated hundreds more programs in existence. This sum is only what we have been able to verify. But the money doesn't just flow from China to U.S. schools. In some districts, they actually spent taxpayer money on this programming. In Nevada, Clark County schools paid over $250,000 in salary and benefits to Chinese teachers. We learned that we need to follow not only inflows, but also outflows. Aside from money, also consider the teachers. Many districts use educators provided by the People's Republic of China, but these teachers are not neutral. In March 2019, President Xi Jinping called on educators to instill patriotism in the country's youth and reject wrong ideas and ideology. Educators who express opinions about Falun Gong or criticize party leadership lose their jobs, so remaining teachers are either true believers or have been cowed into silence. A FOIA from TJ included names of teachers who visited in 2017. 5 of the 6 were CCP members, with 1 receiving an award for being an outstanding communist. Another delegation several months later featured a VIP guest, the party secretary from Zhejiang Provincial Education Department. As employees, foreign nationals are given access to district servers and student information. PDE's work identified 20 districts around the country located near military bases, and we believe that base commanders deserve to know whether potentially hostile foreigners may have access to data about the children of military personnel. Finally, there are curriculum concerns. Multiple contracts reference books and curriculum being provided from Confucius Institutes or partner universities in China. A contract from one California district stated that textbooks, reference materials, and AV materials would be provided by Yunnan Normal University, a school designated medium risk by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute because of the university's research on ethnic minorities and ties to the government's ethnic affairs bureaucracy. Parents and administrators do not know what curriculum is being used in these classrooms and must defer to teachers who were hand-selected and vetted by the PRC. What might this look like in practice? A 2017 documentary shows a student at the University of Michigan singing at a Confucius Institute concert about how Chairman Mao nurtures the people on this land, a slap in the face to the 40 million Chinese citizens who died during the Mao-created famine. As parents, we deserve to know whether hostile nations are pumping propaganda into our children's heads. Some parents may wish to ask their school to hire a teacher from Taiwan instead, while others might want their student to take a different foreign language class. I am a mama Wolverine, and I want my son and daughter to be taught true history about the Uyghur genocide, one-child policy, and the repression of dissidents like Jimmy Lai, not the alleged virtues of communism. America needs greater transparency around foreign funding in our schools. Families lack basic information, so they cannot make informed choices about whether they want their children to participate in these programs. As you said, this is a matter of national security. Over the past year, it has become abundantly clear that America has not fully appreciated the foreign threats aren't just overseas, they're also on our shores. From farmland purchases to spy balloons, secret police stations to battery factories, our country's openness is being weaponized against us. In July, we sent letters to governors asking them to investigate this issue in their states. Unfortunately, few seem to consider this an issue of concern. We ask that you use your influence to communicate the acute nature of this danger to politicians in your respective states. Our other request is one of oversight. We believe that it would be constructive use of the FBI's investigative power to research China's influence in American education, both to monitor programs still in existence and determine the extent of the damage that has been wrought to date. This might be a better use of the Bureau's finite resources than investigating school board parents, a directive still in force today because Attorney General Garland's October 2021 memo has never been rescinded. As members of Congress, you swore oaths to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I ask you today to uphold this oath in order to protect not only our Constitution, but also our children. Thank you.
Ms. Neily, thank you very much for coming and your testimony. Our final witness from Oklahoma, please welcome Mr. Ryan Walters. Mr. Walters, welcome. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Chairman Bean and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me to speak on the topic of foreign influence in K-12 schools. This is a pressing and deeply concerning issue that has ramifications far beyond the K-12 school system. The head of the CCP Central Propaganda Department wrote in 2010 that the Chinese regime should, quote, actively carry out international propaganda battles on core issues and, quote, do well in establishing cultural centers and Confucius institutes. The Chinese government actively set up schools, both in higher education and K-12, with the institution to spread communism and undermine the United States. Knowing this, any response and solution should be bipartisan and a non-controversial issue. We must protect our kids and not allow a hostile foreign government to indoctrinate them. I would like to thank Parents Defending Education for their initial reporting and bringing awareness to this issue of foreign interference, specifically the Chinese government in our K-12 education system. Following the discovery that one of our school districts in Oklahoma, Tulsa Public Schools, was named in the report, my staff diligently conducted a further investigation into the issue and discovered a disturbing connection between the CCP and that school district. Through a series of CCP-affiliated nonprofits, that school district maintains an active connection with the CCP through a program called the Confucius Classrooms, even after the federal government cracked down on similar programs in 2020. The role that the CCP plays in some of our K-12 schools is an issue that goes far beyond the realm of education and has national security implications. Through programs such as Confucius Classrooms, we are allowing a hostile, foreign, anti-democratic government a foothold into our schools. As we saw the initial launch of Confucius Institutes in the United States, when CCP-associated programs are present, there is a demonstrated track record of infringements on academic freedom and the whitewashing of Chinese history. As I'm sure you know, conflicts today are fought on a very different dimension than they were in years past. While we might not take up conventional arms against China and other hostile foreign governments, there is still a deep underlying conflict using the weapons of information, misinformation, and propaganda. It is hard enough to root out Chinese misinformation and propaganda without providing them an influence inside of our schools. The Trump administration had the common sense to stomp out Chinese influence in higher ed. However, it remains to be seen if that common sense exists in the current administration. The American public, as well as Oklahomans, are encouraged that this committee is recognizing that extreme danger and the threat that it provides. I urge that Congress pass a law to ban schools from accepting money from hostile foreign governments and to prohibit schools from entering into data sharing agreements with hostile foreign governments. At the state level, state education agencies should require districts to report any foreign money they accept and any nonprofit money they accept. At our last State Board of Education meeting, we passed this measure, and it will allow us to conduct a more thorough investigation into foreign influence into our schools and provide more transparency to Oklahoma taxpayers. The acceptance of the CCP into our K-12 education system is a small part of the epidemic in the education policies of the far left. The left's education policies attempt to remove parents from their child's education while offering a seat at the table for anyone who wants to promote anti-American positions. These policies undermine the Constitution and the American way of life. And I cannot stress enough how urgent it is that we take action to ensure our education system protects the Constitution and American values. As a government and history teacher, I've taught about these efforts for years. What we see are tyrannical governments using education as a tool to control the masses. Hostile foreign governments use their education system to maintain the dangerous cult of personality that allows the current regimes to stay in power. We see active disinformation campaigns that are in place within these hostile governments, but actively on U.S. soil also. Misinformation and propaganda are dangerous tools in the hands of authoritarian governments, and we will not allow these tools to be used in American classrooms. We are not communist China. In our classrooms, we will teach true history, and we must take an immediate action against hostile countries who attempt to shroud the history in propaganda. The role that people like Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden have played in vilifying parents while directly empowering hostile foreign governments is shameful. While we've seen it in higher ed, we are now seeing it in K-12 as we surrender academic freedom and American values. It is an honor to represent the people of Oklahoma here today to shine light on the undermining of our country. Thank you for your time.
Mr. Walters, thank you very much for all of our witnesses for coming in right as the clock ended. Thank you so much. We're now going to have a conversation, and the conversation begins under Committee Rule 9, where we will have questions under the 5-minute rule. Put the clock on me because I'm going to begin. And let's go with Ms. Neily. Ms. Neily, what do you say that people say that just having this discussion is racist, that the Confucius Classrooms is just a cover for anti-Asian racism? How would you address that?
My grandparents on my father's side met in an internment camp. They met in Manzanar. I know what anti-Asian racism looks like. My family has experienced it. This is not it. Making ad hominem claims that this is a racist hearing is intended to shut down this debate and not engage on the merits. This is a matter of foreign funding. The Chinese government is in an adversarial position against our country right now. And frankly, there are other countries that are also making similar forays into our education system. We are not saying that students shouldn't have access to foreign language programs. That is not what's happening whatsoever. We are saying that parents deserve to know who is funding these programs so that they can decide whether they want their children to participate at all. Making sure what our children are learning is factually accurate is important. And for that to be called racist, I think is appalling. And again, is intended to shut down this discussion altogether.
Thank you very much. Mr. Gonzalez, basically the same question. What do you say that when people say this is just racist, the studying of Chinese influence on classrooms? What do you say to that, Mr. Gonzalez?
Well, thank you, Mr. Bean, Chairman Bean. I got to say, although I subscribe to almost everything that Ms. Perez Kusakawa said, I'm somewhat dumbfounded by the idea that opposing a government that suppresses the rights of 1.4 billion Chinese people is racist. I don't see how these two issues even relate to one another. We have a real problem with the PRC, a dictatorial communist regime that produces fentanyl, that killed 70,000 Americans in 2021, that harasses our warplanes and our naval vessels, that claims the South China Seas as its domain, that has numerous violations of human rights. We have to make sure that that behaves not as an adversary, not as a competitor. We have to make sure that this government does not influence our very young. It does not tell them, does not give a vision of China through our schools or through Hollywood or through the NBA or whatever, that China, that everything that is happening in China is normal. We have to know this. So again, I agree with Mrs. Perez Kusakawa. I don't see what it has to do with the debate we're having.
Thank you, Mr. Gonzalez. And Mr. Walters, the same question. What say you to the charge of racism that this discussion is just racism against Asian Americans?
You know, I completely reject that notion. What we have here are two things. We are allowing a hostile foreign government, as been labeled as such by our government agencies, to influence and indoctrinate our kids. We should be focused on teaching real history, having real academic discussions in the classroom, not censorship and indoctrination from a hostile foreign government. And then there is the national security implications. We are actively allowing a hostile foreign power who has stated their goal to propagandize American young people and American institutions the foothold in order to do that. So this is about a foreign government pushing their influence, undermining American power and American influence, and that's where I think this discussion is.
Did it raise eyebrows, or were there problems getting information from schools and what they have accepted from the Communist Party in the state of Oklahoma?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a great example of breaking the trust of the public. What we have here are these affiliated CCP groups where the money flows into multiple of these groups, which makes it very difficult for our state agency and for parents and taxpayers to see where is the money going, what are the exact expenditures of these programs, and exactly what is the curriculum, where is all of this coming from. It is very intentional. Our team looked at it and said, this is tremendous, the efforts they're going to shield exactly how the money is being spent.
Very good. Thank you so much. You only got a brief moment left. Mr. Gonzalez, you mentioned Mr. Lai. Can you give a quick history of who Mr. Lai is in the brief moments we have left?
He is a very good man. He is a publisher. He published Hong Kong's last independent newspaper. He's been put in prison for speaking truth to power. He's not guilty of any of the charges they have brought up against him. He's a very pro-American man. And I'll just leave with one thing that he said to me once when we were meeting at his house in Hong Kong. Liberty is like oxygen. We take oxygen for granted. We take breaths every second. We don't realize it. But if somebody tries to choke us, we fight for oxygen. It's the same thing with liberty. When somebody takes your liberty away, we fight for it. He's now in solitary confinement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gonzalez. My time's expired. I now recognize Mr. Scott for 5 minutes of questions. Mr. Scott, you're recognized.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we haven't said this is racist. We've said that there was a Senate report after investigation, hearings, and a report that debunked this entire issue. Ms. Kusakawa, are you familiar with that report? Yes, I am. Can you say a word about it?
Yes, the report that you referenced to, there has already been, as you've mentioned, multiple investigations into Confucius Institutes, including by the Senate committee entitled China's Impact on the U.S. Education System. And according to that report, it did not find security risk or threats to intellectual property. This is supported by other well-reputed institutions, including the Brookings Institute, as well as the Hoover Institute at Stanford University.
Thank you. Now, as you mentioned, the United States has a history of excluding, targeting, and scapegoating Asians and Asian Americans as a security threat based on race, religion, and nationality. How does this targeting lead to anti-Asian hate?
Yes, and I think really that's at the heart of the question, which is we are not accusing folks of being racist, but merely asking for caution and really exercising critical and careful approach, understanding the unique experiences that Asian Americans have, especially currently as U.S.-China tensions have peaked. We want genuine dialogue, looking into data-driven approaches and considering where do we genuinely need our resources to be allocated and how do facially neutral or well-intended approaches, how that may have a disproportionate impact on Asian Americans. And so what we're asking today is really that we consider these other reports that have also come out, including the Senate committee's report, consider how Asian American youths may be impacted by broad sweeps and approaches, and how our rhetoric and the way that we speak about China could potentially lead to ramifications for Asian Americans. We have seen that anti-China language does lead to a backlash to Chinese Americans because for many of them, they are not differentiated between this foreign government and who they are here. Now, this is something that is a very important matter to me. I have heard directly from impacted persons during my time as an attorney listening to legal referrals. I understand many of the concerns that Mr. Gonzalez has raised. He has, I believe, raised very exceptional good reasons for why China poses a threat to the United States. But I really ask that folks consider that even though there are real, genuine threats, there is also a real, genuine backlash that the Asian American and immigrant community faces. And this means that we have a responsibility to think on how we can have a nuanced approach moving forward. We saw in the higher ed institutions how families like that of Professor Gang Chen and Professor Xiaoxing Xi were ruined, and the harm is lifelong, let alone for us to have this similar approach with our youth and the K-12 education. Let us learn from the lessons that we've seen and how we've impacted higher ed education, the need for ending the China Initiative and the criminalization of research in our country, and think about how we can treat it differently for our young people so that they also don't get swept up and become collateral damage.
Thank you. And can you speak to what AASF and other organizations you work with are doing to address these issues and the ways that such work impacts K-12 students?
So the Asian American Scholar Forum are also a member of the National Council of Asian Pacific Americans, and our coalition of some of the oldest and most prominent organizations are tackling anti-Asian hate and bigotry holistically across our country. That includes promoting Asian American history, for example, making sure that Asian Americans are not considered threats, lifting up our contributions to this country so we're not just perceived as potential tools in national security. How many people in the United States know that it is an Asian American that allows us to have video calls, go on Zoom? How many know the contributions that they've had in our everyday lives and the technological innovations? These are the very same people who spent their life to contribute to our country. Professor Gang Chen, even after his investigation, went on to lead an innovation in chips technology. These are the sort of talents that we could lose if we don't move forward in a nuanced response. We want to cultivate talent here. We want the United States to remain a US leadership in science and technology because many of the immigrants, many Asian Americans came to this country voting with our feet, rejecting the values of China's government and looking for the American dream.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. Our order of questions will be Ms. Steele, followed by Ms. Bonamici. Ms. Steele, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for hosting this important hearing on foreign influences within our classrooms. I'm a first-generation Korean American. I was born in Korea and raised in Japan, and I speak Korean as my first and Japanese my second, and English is my third. In my district, 41% of first generations are in the district, and out of that, 37% are first generation Asian Americans. They're very hardworking people, and they're very proud of Americans, and I love Chinese Americans. Having said that, stopping Confucius Institute and Confucius classrooms has nothing to do with racism. And Confucius classrooms have no place in the United States. Confucius classrooms are CCP's propaganda. This has nothing to do with Asian Americans, and this has nothing to do with Chinese people. And I'd love to submit for the record for a recent resolution that has unanimously approved by Orange County Board of Education. Mr. Chairman, highlighting the concerns with Confucius Institute and specifically Confucius classrooms. Orange County Board of Education working very hard for the students and
without objection, so entered into the record.
Thank you for the parents. We cannot allow these who hate democracy and freedom to infiltrate our classrooms. And I want to ask Mrs. Neily, that welcome my fellow Pepperdine graduate. I am glad that your organization has shown parents across the country how concerning that it is CCP has become embedded in our classrooms. We all are very much concerned. So my question is, more study has been done and how damaging the students in the classrooms and how stop this propaganda, the threat of allowing influence by CCP.
How to address this? Mm-hmm. I think I'm going to quote from an old G.I. Joe cartoon, knowing is half the battle. We need to get our arms around the scope of this problem, and I think that is one of the problems. We don't know how much money is coming, we don't know where it's going, we don't know where it still exists, and so once we have that basic information, then we can start to address it. Some communities may say we don't want this altogether, other communities may say, you know what, great, we're totally all in, we don't have a problem with this. I believe that that should be up to communities and individuals, but it should not be something that is operating in the shadows without us knowing. As my colleague said, many people fled China because they did not agree with that. Why then is it being pumped into their children's heads once they have come to America? They are being denied an opportunity to have their values put into their children's minds at school. And that's something that we find deeply discouraging. As to a majority of Americans, we conducted polling on this in June, and we found that a vast majority of Americans believe that, yes, absolutely, parents have a right to know what is going on. 87% of respondents who we polled felt that school districts should be required to disclose when they accept money from foreign governments, as Mr. Walters pointed out. 73% felt it was inappropriate for schools to share student data with foreign governments that fund school programs. And 73% disagree that schools should be allowed to charge tens of thousands of dollars to parents seeking information about foreign funding. When I requested documents on this from Fairfax County Public Schools, the initial estimate I was provided was over $35,000. That is appalling that a public school district would throw up a barrier like that in the name of oversight. And things like that should not happen going forward.
Well, that's the reason this education committee passed the parental rights, and they have to know what kind of propaganda that they're teaching, how they spend their money. Mr. Gonzalez, my own parents fled from North Korea from communism, and their stories have impacted me forever. Why must we work hard to protect our kids from influences that come from CCP Confucius classrooms?
Thank you, Representative Steele, for that question. And I spent 2 wonderful years in Korea as a journalist in the late 80s and early 90s, spoke passable Korean. This is a foreign political party that is totalitarian. Everywhere that communism has been tried, it has ended in tyranny with the suppression of people's rights and economic chaos. What they want to do is influence our children into believing that, no, it's a good system and China is a normal country that is not tyrannical. We cannot allow that to happen.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Up next is our ranking member, Ms. Bonamici. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. I want to start by reiterating that oftentimes the way this committee discusses alleged foreign influence in American schools and colleges can be unproductive and harmful. And I agree with Ms. Kusakawa that has real implications across the country. And again, to emphasize, there was a report that was done. There was an 8-month in-depth investigation into Confucius Institutes, and they did not find security risks, curriculum vulnerability, or threats to intellectual property, and they found no evidence that suggests that they're a center for Chinese espionage efforts or any illegal activity. That report was done, comprehensive. And although issues of national security are important to all of our members, they're not in this committee's jurisdiction, not in the subcommittee's jurisdiction. What is in our jurisdiction is for every student to have a high-quality public education and to protect students' civil rights. Take that responsibility seriously, and this hearing unfortunately misses the mark. My daughter studied Mandarin. She studied at 2 U.S. colleges. She studied at a university in China. Like thousands of students across the country, she benefited greatly from that experience. In fact, people frequently noted that her language skills would give her an advantage in the workforce. I was not concerned at all that the experience would turn her into a communist or that she might be recruited to be a foreign agent. That did not concern me one bit. I was grateful, in fact, that she had access to a multicultural, multilingual education that exposed her to perspectives and life experiences different from her own. Ms. Kusakawa, in her written testimony, Ms. Neily mentions the Sisters Oregon School District in my home state of Oregon as one of 2 school districts that hired and paid native Chinese teachers to teach students. Now, there's no concrete evidence that these teachers were influenced by the CCP or had any intentions besides teaching language and culture to American students. And I'm going to talk about that just for a minute before I ask you this question. Sisters, for everyone's information, is a pretty small town in central Oregon. The program was run by an American businessman. He was the program manager, American businessman who had spent a lot of time overseas. He was a certified teacher. And that's what they did. They taught Chinese language. It was originally set up through Portland State University, which at the time did, but no longer has. At the time they had a Confucius Institute. It's no longer there. You wouldn't get that from reading the testimony. It's been years, and I happen to know that the reason it was set up was because we had a Republican state legislator who thought it was great for students to learn Mandarin and actually promoted Confucius Institutes. It's gone now. They're concerned that the program might not be able to continue, but they're working on it because they see it as a tremendous advantage for students to be able to come bilingual. And I note in Ms. Neely's testimony, you also make there's a comment made about how Americans don't know what's in the curriculum because they're not bilingual. I assure that the people in Sisters know what's in that curriculum. They have a director who's bilingual, and they make that happen. So Ms. Kawa, why is it beneficial? Why might it be beneficial for students to have the opportunity to learn a language directly from a native speaker or someone who's fluent? And why would a school district want to hire a teacher to teach a variety of world languages?
Thank you so much. And I think one of the key points in this is how the United States overall is lagging when it comes to foreign language education and the benefits that we could have in making sure that we cultivate talents here on U.S. soil, that many youth, like Ms. Bonamici's daughter, are folks that become fluent and become wonderful resources for our country and in the service of so many of our values. And we also need to bring talents from abroad. Being able to have our American values to attract and cultivate talent is one of the things that makes the United States competitive. We have always been known as a beacon of light in the world, and we want to make sure that we continue to be that beacon of light. And what's a really integral part of that is making sure that our youth become global leaders. And a key part of becoming global leaders is making sure that they're bilingual, multilingual, that they have exposure to different cultures and languages that will train and hone their skills to the benefit of our country. And so there are a lot of benefits in making sure that they have this engagement with native speakers. It is also noted, for example, with the University of Massachusetts, they had conducted a study on the benefits of non-native and native speakers. There are benefits for both, with native speakers having tremendous benefits in terms of increasing the speaking capabilities of their students. It is their native language, and they are more prone to speak it in their classrooms. And so we hope that these are the sort of benefits that the youth could have moving forward.
The Early Childhood Elementary Subcommittee, I'll note that I've done academic research in this area, and it's actually very beneficial for students to study a second language or any world language. It helps them in their other topics, and it helps them to think critically. So that's what we should be talking about today, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bonamici. Up next is Utah. Burgess Owens. Representative Owens, you're recognized. 4 questions for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Appreciate it. Within our country's DNA is an understanding that education is imperative for the attainment of Americans' promise of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. My parents had a full confidence in my 1960 school system that it would reinforce the values taught at home and the love and respect for the culture of the freedom that my dad fought for in World War II. That generation would be horrified today to see the proliferation of anti-American propaganda in our school systems. As educators, they would be stunned to see portrayal of complicit school administrators who today, for the right price, and at the behest of our enemy, the Chinese Communist Party, grants a platform to indoctrinate our kids. They then use our children to attack the foundation of our American culture: faith, family, the free market, and education. We've witnessed over the last decade in K-12 school districts the establishment of Confucius classrooms throughout our country. They are financed by the same CCP that today enslaves and tortures over 1 million Muslim Uyghurs, threatens to invade a free and prosperous Taiwan, and is responsible for the deaths of over tens of millions of men, women, and children throughout the 20th century. This same CCP, with the help of American school administrators, now seek to propagandize our children that communism is good and that the culture of free market, free speech, and freedom of religion is bad. American parents on both sides of the aisle are waking up to the tactics of the CCP and are in agreement that it's time to stop playing guacamole. We're committed federally to stay within our lane. Through collaboration with state legislators and through the power of the purse, we will hold those who betray our children accountable, and we will create and implement solutions to address the CCP's stealth attack on our educational system. Ms. Neily, we've heard a lot about this, about the Chinese soft power strategy and how they want to influence our children through Confucius classrooms. I think that alone is enough to be concerned, but what else is China getting in exchange for funding these programs?
Some recent public records requests that we got back from Fairfax County Public Schools showed when the teachers came over in 2017, they had access to lesson plans, floor plans, they met with teachers, and then they went back and frankly ripped off the intellectual property. There is a series of schools in the People's Republic of China called Thomas schools. In their recruiting materials, they brag about using TJ's STEM model. We now watch Thomas Jefferson High School, which has fallen in the rankings from being America's #1 STEM high school to, just yesterday, was ranked #7. It is now unable to compete against its foreign corollaries. And so while our schools are mired in equity fights, while they are focused on identity politics, we are not teaching our children the basics that they need, reading, writing, and arithmetic, to compete in a global economy. And so there is that IP that has been ripped off. There is, as we referenced before, possible access to student data. That is something that is very concerning, that we definitely need to know more about. Public schools are just not good at securing student data at all, period. They're asking students intrusive surveys, regularly violating the PPRA, asking them about race and politics and sex and gender. What happens to that? Is it stored on a Google document? We don't know who is accessing this information. On average, 2 school districts a day are hacked. There are ransomware attacks around the country. And so this is not just a threat from outside, but it is also a threat from people who work in these school systems. And then, the list goes on and on, but there's a lot to be worried about.
Thank you so much. Superintendent Walters, you talked a bit in your testimony the federal government could do to address the problems. I'd love to hear how you expand that with the concept of Congress taking time to address these foreign influences without violating the principles of federalism.
Thank you for that question very much, and I appreciate the leadership of this committee addressing this problem. I think, first of all, this is an issue of national security. When you look at the indoctrination going on in our classrooms from several different perspectives, this is one of the most heinous. Frankly, when you look at this, this is a failure of Nancy Pelosi's leadership when this was brought to her attention. The Biden administration, this failure to secure our schools and education system is traitorous. We have to ensure that our schools are not being undermined by a hostile foreign government. I believe that any American, I've heard this from Republicans, Democrats, parents from all backgrounds, they do not want communist China in our schools. What they want is a history focused on academics, schools that are focused on promoting American values in this country. And so I believe that you'll have a consensus. I think this committee is showing true leadership, and you will see a consensus of parents across the country that will stand with you to say thank you.
Thank you for that. And I'll just say this, the word traitors, betrayal should be spoken very boldly. We have Americans that are allowing this to happen to our children. That is unacceptable. And I'll just say this, so thank you guys so much. We're going to be on this one, and I appreciate your testimony. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Owens. Mr. Grijalva, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And, you know, the backdrop to this hearing, and I associate myself with the full committee ranking members' opening comments to this hearing. The backdrop is that the proposed cuts in a very critical area like public education would effectively dismantle the public school system across this country, period. When you get rid of Title I, when you get rid of Title III, when you begin to reduce the availability of preschool for all children in this country, you begin to dismantle the system. And so I think that's the backdrop, and that's the reality that we're facing. But let me ask Ms. Kusakawa, let's talk about school climate. Elementary, secondary schools right now are comprised of diverse students, teachers, staff. To support this diversity, schools and districts are increasingly working to improve school climate, to create a positive learning environment that benefits all the students. My question is, how are today's demographics of students affecting education, especially K-12, in that school climate and the new demography, the new face of public schools?
Thank you so much for that question. I think what we're really seeing is a trickle-down effect on the young people in terms of what the current climate is in academia. I want to share a quote from one youth advocate and recent high school graduate who spoke at the White House. She said, since the pandemic, she feels terrified for her safety and her Asian peers. It feels dangerous to even be Asian in public, especially as a teenager who may be susceptible to attack. Moreover, a recent report in the spring of 2021 by Act to Change reported over 3,785 incidents of verbal harassment, shunning, and physical assaults from March 2020 to February 2021. Of these incidents, 13% of the victims were 0 to 17-year-olds, with adults as the perpetrators in 60% of the incidents. As I mentioned before, much of that is to blame. Folks are worried that they are being scapegoated under U.S.-China tensions and accusations of Chinese government spying. While these do pose real and genuine threats to our country, we need to learn from our experiences with higher education. We need a calm approach. We need to avoid hysteria, and we need a more surgical approach in assessing risk, what mitigation efforts are actually needed, and how we can make sure that this does not lead to any backlash to Asian Americans and our youth.
Thank you very much for Mr. Waters. Thank you very much for being here, Superintendent. I understand that you have your hands full with, I think, your threatened political takeover of the largest school district in your state because of their woke ideology. So let me be respectful of your time. Yes or no to my questions would be sufficient. Would you say your testimony focuses a lot on the influence of outside funding in our education system and how that undermines our public school system? It talks about the global influence, but little questions about consistency here. Would you say it is a conflict of interest to have oil and gas fracking entities and industry dictate education curriculum on the environment in your schools? Yes or no?
These are American companies that are a benefit to American economy, so I don't see any issue with them having influence on our education system.
But that's okay.
Yes, sir. Yeah,
Okay.
they're a benefit to American society.
No, I'm just looking for consistency,
Okay.
my friend. Are you aware that PragerU, the non-accredited education site for which you just announced a partnership, has received millions of dollars from oil and gas interests, and that's okay?
They promote American values and support our history without
Okay.
indoctrination. Yes, sir.
Which leads me to the question about, do you think public dollars should go to private entities without any transparency, without any oversight?
I think taxpayer dollars should follow a child to where the parent chooses to send a child, so I believe parents know best for kids.
What about the oversight and accountability for those dollars?
There's no better oversight than a parent having the ability to choose the school for their child. They are the best accountability officer for our children.
Well, so much for consistency. Yield back.
Thank you very much. Let's go to Representative McLean. Representative McLean, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Amen to that, Mr. Walters. Crazy concept that parents have the best oversight of their kids. Wow. I can't even believe that's controversial. But anyways, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to all the witnesses being here today. It is well documented that the Chinese Communist Party has been engaged in a long-standing campaign to infiltrate the American public education system in an attempt to poison the minds of our nation's children. So I'm here to represent our kids, the American children, the majority. That's my job. That's what I'm elected to do. And by God, that's what I'm going to do, right? I mean, wake up, people. China is not our friend. Look around. They are coming after us educationally, militarily, academically, economically. I mean, turn the news on. Unless you live under a rock, this is the reality in which we live. And I will not apologize to protect our American children. Period. End of conversation. Because that's what the voters in my district elected me to do. So with that, sorry, a little bit passionate, story got away from me. Mr. Neily, can you talk more about the findings in the PDE's report, specifically on the 20 Confucius classrooms located near military installations, ironically, coincidentally, and how does this threaten our national security?
Sure. So the 20 military bases that we identified these programs operating near: the Naval Academy in Annapolis, Buckley Air Force Base, Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, Dover Air Force Base, Fort Bliss, Fort Liberty, which was formerly known as Fort Bragg, Fort Knox, Naval Great Lakes, Hanscom Air Force Base.
Can I just stop you in the interest of time? I appreciate that. So
I will,
there's
yeah.
20
There's 20 yes.
near military bases.
Correct.
How many Confucius institutes do you know of teaching in our American schools right now?
As of today, we know that there are at least 7 that are in operation, but these are all ones that we have current contracts in hand to prove. We suspect that there are many, many more. The Senate, and others have estimated about 500 programs operating around the country. And so it's a big question as to what's actually taking place, because so much of it has gone underground. And so to your question about the military bases, we don't know what is happening. And that to me is the most frightening part. Who are these employees? What do they have access to? And what is going back and forth, both going into the minds of our children and then what data is flowing out of these schools?
And can you talk about what would be the harm to be so transparent to the parents of these children?
Transparency is not harmful, and that's why I find the fact that
unless you're hiding something, and unless you have an ulterior motive, then transparency, right, would you agree with me, is gravely harmful.
Yeah, I mean, I have yet to hear a good argument why families shouldn't have access to know where the money is coming from and what their kids are learning.
Right.
We are being hit with ad hominem attacks, and this is being called racist. What is real racism in American schools today? We just saw the Harvard decision. That was racism against American students. We have seen affinity groups where children are being segregated on the basis of skin color in 2023 in American schools. That is real racism. Talking and asking questions and saying families deserve information about who is funding their schools is not racist.
I can't agree more with you. You go. Is it possible for these teachers from China, possible, from these teachers from China to access sensitive student information, like their health care, grades, maybe where they live? Is it possible, or are our schools just locked down so tight on this sensitive information?
School data security is terrible. I'm sure Superintendent Walters can speak more about this, but student information is there, it's in a big file, and pretty much anybody has access to it. And so that is something that concerns me deeply, because basically anybody who has access to a school server should be able to access pretty much anything. But I defer to Superintendent Walters.
All right, I thank you. Is it also possible for the CCP, through these Chinese teachers, possible, I say, is that they're influencing children to divulge information on parents stationed at these critical military bases? Could they get that information?
I would assume, yes, it is absolutely possible to ask a child. I'm the parent of an 8-year-old and a 9-year-old, and man, they tell everybody everything about me.
With my 10 seconds remaining, I just want everyone to think about, who are we protecting here? I'll share with you who I'm protecting. I took an oath to protect the Constitution and to protect Americans, and especially our children. And that's what I think we intend to do. And I think we need to continue to look at the harm that transparency is causing, or I should say, lack thereof. So thank you all for your witnesses. I'm over. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Representative. Representative Saulnier, you were recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. You clearly took high school French with that pronunciation at some point. Well, I want to thank all the witnesses. I think obviously important for transparency for our kids and future generations. Ms. Kusakawa, a friend of mine, Peter Schrag, is a fairly well-known researcher on the West Coast. I'm from California. Both on education and immigration. His last 2 books have been about the Pacific Rim and how important it is in a global economy and how America benefits from the diversity of immigration. But we understand we have people in the Pacific Rim who may not want us to do well in this country. But he speaks to the strength. So while we're careful about the transparency, I think, on a bipartisan level, and people who don't wish us well in other countries, global competitors, we also have to balance that with what Peter Schrag's written about how similar this immigration the last 30 years on the Pacific Rim was to the late 1800s and early 1900s on the Atlantic Rim, but this is more diverse. And again, in the global economy, with the 2 largest economies competing and sometimes complementing one another, in California being the 4th largest economy, what his research shows that although we have many challenges with diversity and technology, it's something to be welcomed, which seems logical to me in a global economy. Could you speak to that, the importance of the richness and acceptability of diversity, while at the same time recognizing the reality of global politics?
No, absolutely. And I think AASF really pushes for a balanced approach because we recognize so many of America's strengths is in our openness and in our diversity. The Asian American community is a predominantly immigrant community, and this is how we end up having new Asian Americans that can be a wonderful resource and community here in the United States. And so I think what's really important here is looking to make sure that we are grounded in facts and data and not look towards speculation or overreaction. There are already existing reports on this issue, and we urge folks to look into it, especially the Senate report, the Brookings Institute report. There has been so much time and investment. We understand that there are real, genuine threats, but let's not shoot ourselves in the foot and harm our competitive advantage in the United States. It is our values that make us strong. It is our openness, our ability to cultivate our youth to be global leaders that makes us absolutely unique on the world stage.
And a follow-up question. I represent a district in the East Bay that has grown dramatically, and traditionally the commute was into San Francisco, but much of the population, particularly in the southern end of my district, are Asian immigrants who work in Silicon Valley. So the confluence of technology, particularly for young people and diversity, could you speak to that? My anecdotal experience is it's remarkable, but again, we have to be aware that there are people who want to use that, particularly for future generations.
Yes, actually, in the current climate, we have seen a report, for example, that our membership had drafted and was published in the Proceedings of National Academies, from which many Nobel laureates come from, had found that we are actually losing talent in the United States. We are having researchers who are scared of applying for federal grants. And at the end of the day, this hurts our technological advancement here in the United States. Losing talent is not just about losing one person. It's about losing a potential innovation, our advantages in chips technology, the innovations that we ended up having in cell phones because of contributions of Asian Americans. And so this is a widespread issue in our education system, in our private sector, in our academic institutions, and we need to make sure we have the right approach. We need to be data-driven in our policies, and we need to take into consideration the Asian American experience. They are the people our country needs, their contributions, their talents, and their attributes, and we hope that that can be taken into consideration.
Well, I really appreciate that. I'll just finish with what my friend Peter talks about in his 2 books, about that this wave of immigration is actually assimilating faster than the European waves of immigration. So having someone who grew up on the 128 corridor in Boston and watching my parents and grandparents talk about their assimilation, Peter's research would suggest that this is actually a model, that this immigration, again, acknowledging that there's a global competition, and we, to the other witnesses in their perspective, we can't be naive about what other global competitive economies and their rulers want to do to this country. Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Saulnier, thank you so much. We now recognize Mr. Thompson from Pennsylvania. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, Chairman, thank you very much. I think, just a context for this, thank you for this hearing. I think it's just important to point out our problem is not with the Chinese people or people of Chinese descent. The problem is with the current Chinese government. So, let's focus where the problem is. I believe in root cause analysis, and it's the Chinese government. It's not the Chinese people or Chinese Americans or anything like that. And I think we need to be eyes wide open here. Why is this really risen to the top? And it should be talked about anyways, but frankly, we have the Chinese government that, we hear all the time about the purchase of U.S. agriculture acreage by the Chinese government, some of that in proximity to military installations, some of it not. Spying both in and over the United States has been in the headlines. Establishing overseas military bases, stealing resources in the South Central China Sea, intimidating Taiwan. The list is lengthy, and we could probably do a hearing just on that. But our point today is what it really is the pathway to opportunity, and it's the influence on education. And so I want to thank the chairman and all of our witnesses. As our students in schools struggle to recover from pandemic-induced learning losses, I think we can all agree that this is an appropriate time to evaluate every aspect of our children's educational system, including foreign influence by foreign countries. Now, while we have discussed issues of foreign influence in higher education, I'm increasingly concerned about the reports of the Chinese government influence, and I include the military with that, in our elementary and secondary schools. Now, we know that soft power is one of the main ways that the Chinese Communist Party seeks to gain influence around the world, and we must remain on guard of these attempts on U.S. soil. They don't do it in a vacuum. There's a short list I shared with you, among other things, that China is very aggressive right now, and probably has been, and we just haven't been paying as close attention in the past. Mr. Gonzalez, in your many years of working around the world, can you tell us a bit more about where you've seen the CCP use so-called soft power to gain influence over local communities and other countries? I think that's important under the premise that the best predictor of future performance is past performance. And how does this usually play out?
Thank you, Representative Thompson. When we speak about Chinese soft power, we have to be very clear about what we mean. There are people all over the world that wear New York Yankees caps and blue jeans. We're very appealing as a society in a way that China is not. Nobody wears China, we all wear Chinese apparel, but China doesn't have the kind of appeal that we have. What China does, for example, is with Hollywood here in this country. They have invested heavily in Hollywood studios, and what they say to the studios, if you want, it has the second largest box office in the world after we do. If you want to show this movie in China, you have to let us look at the script. We have to be involved from the very beginning. Sometimes Hollywood studios have made two versions of a movie, one to be shown in China, one to be shown here. Or they have just really cut back on any criticism of China. Richard Gere, who was a top box office hit in the 90s, all of a sudden disappeared. Why did he disappear? Because he was best friends with the Dalai Lama. And China sent very clearly the message, if you use Richard Gere in any of your movies, you're not going to be able to show any of them here. So that is the kind of thing China does all over the world. It also, for example, buys radio stations in Australia, here in the US, in many other countries. You're not aware that you're listening to Chinese propaganda, that you're not going to hear anything about the Uyghur genocide. You're not going to hear anything about how China violated its word that it gave the world, that it was going to respect the rights of Hong Kong citizens, and it has done nothing of the sort. You're not going to get any of that in any textbook or any teacher that comes from China, from the PRC, to teach in our schools. This is a major issue, one that should really be bipartisan. And I thank you, Chairman Bean, for holding this very important hearing, because this is an issue that should concern all of us.
So, Mr. Gonzalez, with about 30 seconds left here, you said we should be taking measures, we should be showing action. What measures do you believe Congress can take today to ensure that we prevent the influence of malicious foreign actors in and around our nation's schools?
Well, as Ms. Neily said, I think we should demand transparency in the contracts. What is wrong with transparency? The American people have the right to know what is in the contracts between the Confucius classrooms or the remaining Confucius institutes and the schools. Hanban, well, they used to be Hanban, it's now another institution that runs the Confucius classrooms and institutes. Transparency is something we should all welcome as a democracy.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let's go to Mr. Williams of New York. You're recognized for 5 minutes and questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. I think this is an important topic of our day. In May of 1989 was the last time I was in China. I was there during the Tiananmen Square protest as part of a visiting school trip, and spent several days in the capital. And among the students that were protesting there, it was only, I guess, about 3 or 4 weeks later that we learned what the consequence of that would be. During my time, I visited Beijing University, Beida, and saw the Freedom Wall and the expressions of hope and aspiration and desire in the eyes of the Chinese students. Following fall semester, I enrolled at Harvard University in an Asian Studies program, Chinese Studies program. Many of the dissident students who had fled their country were present and had firsthand testimony of all that had occurred. I think we all know how the Chinese Communist Party views education. They view education as being entirely subordinate to the party, to the message of socialism and communism, and they will brook no debate on that topic, including rolling tanks in Tiananmen Square and threatening their own people. Shockingly, I have discovered, closer to home, a report from the Parents Defending Education that has pointed to 12 New York schools that have received hundreds of thousands of dollars in total of funding from the Chinese Communist Party. Have they discovered some new enlightenment of supporting education in America? I don't think so, because they are diametrically opposed to what the goal of education in America should be, which is to produce students, to produce citizens that are able to express themselves, able to know their own thoughts, that are able to articulate their values and defend them against the government if necessary. So I doubt seriously if funding from the Chinese Communist Party has anything positive to do with education in America. So this is a deeply problematic issue for me. I recently wrote a letter to our governor, Governor Hochul, asking her to stop this, to investigate it, to root it out, and to eliminate it. And I would ask your help. My first question is, what can state governments like mine, how can I advise Kathy Hochul to mitigate the influence of the Chinese Communist Party in our education system? How can we protect the children of New York?
Thank you for your question, and I appreciate your sentiment there. In Oklahoma, what we've done is we have required every district to tell us if they've taken any money from a foreign government. We are also requiring them to turn over any funds coming into their district from a nonprofit. What we have seen is Communist China utilize affiliated nonprofit groups to do that. I think every state should do this. It gives you the ability as a taxpayer, as a parent, as a grandparent to see what's going on in the schools, and then we should start banning this practice.
If I may just follow up in the time that we have, at a federal level, looking at the Department of Education and this Congress, what is it that we can do that can help address this issue nationwide?
I know Representative Jim Banks sent a letter to Secretary Cardona asking him to investigate this. Senator Tim Scott led a similar effort on the Senate side. At the higher education level, there is Section 117 of the Higher Education Act, which requires the colleges disclose gifts of received from and contracts with a foreign source that combined hit $250,000 or more in a calendar year. We ask that you put in place something similar for K-12, but I would urge you to put in place a far lower threshold. The average value of the gifts that we found was around $10,000, so very low. And as we know from the Bank Secrecy Act, there are bad actors that structure transactions to avoid that reporting threshold. And so I would urge you to have something that is very low and that brings in both contracts as well as pass-through entities, as Mr. Walters alluded to.
It's interesting that we look for money laundering at amounts $10,000 and above, but we don't look for the influence of a hostile nation at a similar level. Thank you so much for drawing attention to this and providing your expertise. I yield back.
Thank you very much. The chair is pleased to recognize the chair of the main committee, Dr. Fox. Representative Fox, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to reiterate what was said earlier about the fact that we're concerned about the influence of the communist Chinese government here. We are not in any way conflating that concern with talking about Asian Americans. And we're very, very big believers in transparency in this committee, and everything that we talk about, that's what we are asking for. Mr. Gonzalez, you mentioned this briefly in your testimony, but what kind of solutions would you recommend for the problem of foreign influence in K-12 schools?
Well, I believe that given the fact that we're talking about a foreign adversary, the Congress has very much a role here to play in, I would, as I said, suspend all collaboration between U.S. entities and PRC entities that have to do with anything with the State Security Ministry, which is intelligence, or with defense, or anything that, obviously we're going to trade with China, but anything that has to do with defense and or intelligence, you should ban it. Because they're going, as Representative said before, they mean ill to us. They're not paying for these books because we want to learn. They want us to learn. We should learn Mandarin. I've studied Mandarin myself personally, and Japanese and Korean. This is not what this is about. This is about a foreign party, a communist party run country that is trying to influence how we think and how we act.
Thank you. I think it's important that that statement be very clear to people. Ms. Neily, we've talked a lot about the Chinese Communist Party, and for good reason, but I'm afraid other countries might try to copy what they're doing. Is there evidence that other countries are trying to infiltrate U.S. K-12 education?
There is actually. We found recently several $100,000 in donations going from the Cutter Foundation to schools in Arizona. And in a public records request I got back again from Fairfax County Public Schools, we found an inquiry from the Skolkovo Foundation in Russia, which is tied to former Premier Dmitry Medvedev. We're still trying to chase that down, but it very much feels like American schools seem to have an open for business shingle out, and that is deeply worrying.
Thank you very much. Ms. Neily, someone listening to this hearing might come away thinking this is a partisan issue, but I actually suspect that parents on both sides of the aisle do not want foreign governments, especially communist powers, indoctrinating their children. Do you have any polling on how parents feel about this issue?
Yes, we conducted polling on this issue in June just to test the waters and see how people felt. And as you alluded to, there was certainly bipartisan agreement that this kind of interference is inappropriate. 58% of people felt that it was inappropriate for schools to accept money at all from foreign governments. 57% believe that schools should be required to provide translations of materials. 73% felt it was inappropriate for schools to share student data with foreign governments that fund school programs, and 87% felt that respondents felt that districts should be required to disclose when they accept money from foreign governments.
Well, thank you. I'm going to do one more follow-up question on it. You've done a lot of work to give us a better sense of how deeply the CCP has become embedded in the classrooms. What can future researchers do to help us get a better sense of the problem?
You know, the 2019 Senate report has come up a lot, and I think the world has changed a lot since then. We know a lot more, and I urge Congressional Research Service to update that report. Let's think back to when the spy balloon was flying over America a few months ago. Initially, we just thought, hey, this was harmless, and then when it crashed and we dissected it, we found out it was absolutely not. And so I think very much like with that, with the education reports, we should know now, we know more now than we did then, and we should continue to investigate this.
Thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fox. Let's go to Mr. Wahlberg. Mr. Wahlberg, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, thank you for allowing me to wave on to the subcommittee. It's an important subject, and thanks to the panel for being here. The Communist Party has a long, dark history of political suppression, persecution, and violence, and that's against their own people. I think that's what we need to make very clear. Our hearts break for the Chinese people, whether they be Uyghurs or others, whether you have organ harvesting going on, religious, political persecution. And any of us who have been to China understand a repressive sense that you have there where truth isn't honored or even allowed. Unfortunately, we've seen a rise in the CCP's influence in our education institutes, and living in the shadow of major universities like the University of Michigan, I've seen it and experienced it, and for too long didn't take it seriously myself. As we've heard today, the CCP has achieved some success in undermining and infiltrating our schools, both at the K-12 and post-secondary institutions. At the K-12 level, these Confucius classrooms act as a foothold for the CCP to disseminate propaganda to whitewash the atrocities of past communist regimes. These classrooms are part of a broader effort to advance Chinese interests by exercising soft power on all American educational institutions. They downplay horrific Chinese human rights abuses, chill or prohibit discussion of the Tiananmen Square massacre, and suppress opposition to Chinese aggression toward Taiwan. And disturbingly, younger generations of Americans are increasingly unaware of communism abuses, like I certainly was aware as a child of the 50s and 60s, hiding under my desk in nuclear bomb training sessions from the Soviet Union, communism, and certainly CCP. 28% of Gen Z hold a favorable opinion of the term communism, compared to just 6% and 3% for baby boomers and the silent generations, respectively. Ms. Neily, last week this committee passed the crucial Communism Teaching Act, which will facilitate the development of educational resources so students can better understand the dangers of communism and totalitarianism, and how those systems are contrary to our founding principles of freedom and democracy. Former Secretary DeVos, who I was with last week, and Secretary Pompeo pushed back against the influence of Confucius Institutes in our education system during the previous administration. In your opinion, how can Congress and this administration build off the Trump administration's policies while still respecting local control? And I guess I would also ask Mr. Walters' answer to that, because I'd prefer that we not have a U.S. Department of Education, that the buck for education would stop at the greatest level at the State Department of Education. So Ms. Neily first, and then Mr. Walters.
Sure. Randy Weingarten uses the phrase teaching true history, and I appreciate that your efforts to advance the cause of teaching the true history about communism, teaching the true history about what's taking place in these countries. It's something that Florida has taken the lead in, and I expect many other states to do so as well. So I think that's a very important first step. So we appreciate that. I will let Secretary Walters or Superintendent Walters talk about the state federalism issue.
Congressman, I appreciate your comments there. I agree with you. I don't think there should be a federal Department of Education. But when you look at a situation like this, it involves national security. We're talking about an issue where we've got our military personnel preparing now for potential issues with foreign countries that are this adversarial. I believe that this is of the highest order for our national security to ensure that we do not have this invasion of our schools through a foreign enemy. So I believe that this is absolutely appropriate for the federal government to step in to preserve the safety of American citizens, to ensure that we do not have a hostile foreign government utilizing propaganda in our schools.
Let me turn to you, Mr. Gonzalez, with your background in the media as well as at the executive level. How do we do this and respect local control?
And respect what?
Local control.
Well, I think, as Mr. Walters said, given the fact that we're looking at a hostile power, the federal government very definitely has a role. I believe very strongly that education belongs at the local level to the families. They're the natural sovereign of education. At least the states, the federal government should stay away most of the time. This is one area in which, because it's an issue of national security, that you can, I urge you to do what you can to ban these, to prohibit these collaborations.
Some of us ought to be looking at it. Yeah.
Thank you.
I thank the gentleman
very much. Thank you, Mr. Wahlberg. We are nearing the end of our conversation. That concludes our questions. I now recognize Ms. Bonamici for a closing statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the panel. Unfortunately, today's hearing has been another part of the majority's extreme MAGA agenda to inject culture wars and partisan politics into our public schools in a way that can fuel anti-Asian American bias and provide a platform for claims that have been found by a comprehensive investigation to be unsubstantiated, not well documented. I want to say I agree with Mr. Thompson from Pennsylvania that the problem is not the Chinese people, the problem is the Chinese government. Unfortunately, that's often not the way that it's perceived by the public when we have a hearing like this. And I also want to note that the hearing is taking place. We are less than 2 weeks away from a possible government shutdown, because extremist Republicans are threatening an array of extremely devastating cuts to federal programs that are critical to support all students' rights to a high-quality public education. And I want to reiterate that although issues of national security are important to all of our members, they are not under the jurisdiction of this committee. Instead, we can and should discuss how to provide students with an inclusive, accurate, and well-funded education without promoting conspiracy theories, fear-mongering, or fueling anti-Asian American discrimination. And I mentioned accurate. It's interesting that you all agree that students should get an accurate teaching about what happens in China. They should also get an accurate teaching about what's happened in the United States and our history here. I also am glad that there seems to be an agreement that studying world languages is important. I'm glad. I don't think anybody disagrees with that. But I want to reiterate that right now the majority is proposing significant cuts to the federal education budget. If federal funding is cut, it is extremely unlikely that districts will offer second language or world languages except the high-income districts. Cutting federal funding to the extent that's being proposed would be devastating across the country. Our role as federal legislators in education is about equity of opportunity and closing opportunity gaps. We'll see the high-income districts continue to have world language, but not the low-income districts, and that's really unfortunate. I also want to note, because it's part of the testimony, in the written testimony, I visit schools and classrooms across Oregon, urban, suburban, rural, in red and blue areas. And I've never, ever seen anyone trying to remove parents from their child's education, and I've never seen any school trying to embrace hostile foreign governments. So I invite my Republican colleagues to stand with congressional Democrats. We've laid out a clear legislative agenda that puts students, parents, and educators on a path to success by fostering healthier and more inclusive school climates, rebuilding aging and physically unsafe school facilities, and protecting the civil rights of all students. Thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member Bonamici. For the last several decades, China has been aggressively seeking to be the dominant player in the world. They've been aggressively moving against our country and other countries, whether it's mineral rights or being just undermining our efforts with the dollar and whatnot. America needed a wake-up call. I think that wake-up call came in the form of a Chinese spy balloon that we saw firsthand the true actions of this country. Today, I think we all have raised a red flag of what's happening in the classroom. And now that we know what's going on, hopefully we can take actions as they've done in Oklahoma and across the nation of what they've done to counteract and realize that this is happening. Our takeaway, if anybody's watching, our takeaway, it's not against the Chinese people. It's against the aggressive nature of the Chinese government. And so with that, I think we're all better off that we're armed ourselves with the facts and information that we can go work on giving our kids the best unbiased education that we possibly can give. Our panelists, you did great today. Thank you so much for making the trip. We appreciate your input and being a part of the conversation. Without objection, there being no further business, the subcommittee stands adjourned.